The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the sort of day that offered no warning of its own destruction. Marian Ashby had been in the East Passage counting the linen when the footman passed with the silver tray, and she heard, quite clearly, the sound of her husband's study door close on a conversation she had not been invited to join. She did not think much of it. She had grown practiced at not thinking much of things. What she could not have known as she smoothed the last pillowcase and set it on the stack was that the man in the study was a painter, and that before the month was out, her place in this house would exist only in what she chose to do about it. 11 days. That was what remained before the Ashby family portrait was to be completed and hung in the gallery before the autumn estate gathering, where every neighbor within 30 miles would come to stand beneath it with their sherry and their observations. 11 days was not much time to save a marriage, a reputation, and a truth that had been buried under 17 months of careful paperwork. She did not know that yet either. She knew only that the linen was counted, the household accounts were balanced to the farthing as they always were, and that when she descended the back stair to the kitchen, Cook looked up and then looked quickly away, which was the kind of look Marian had learned to read like a barometer before a storm. "Is there something you wish to say to me, Mrs. Petch?" Marian asked. The old woman set down her cleaver with more precision than the task required. "Only that Mr. Ashby has given Mr. Daw his instructions for the portrait, ma'am. As to the sittings." "And the instructions were?" A pause that had weight to it. "That Miss Cavendish would be seated center, ma'am. Beside the master. And the children on the outside." Marian absorbed this the way she had learned to absorb most blows, by becoming very still, by finding something nearby to make orderly. She straightened the row of copper pots along the shelf. One was fractionally askew. She corrected it. "I see," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Petch." She went back upstairs and closed her own door and sat at the small writing desk that had belonged to her mother, and did not weep, because weeping was a luxury that spent what she could not afford to spend. Lenora Cavendish had been in the house for 6 months, installed as a companion to the elder children with a smoothness that spoke of long planning. She was 22 to Marian's 9 and 20. She had a face that painters liked. She had, apparently, the center of the portrait. What Marian had was 7 years of marriage, 2 children who called her Mama, a household that ran like a clock because she wound it, and a set of account books kept in her own hand that no one had asked to read in the better part of a year. She opened the topmost book now and turned to September. She had noticed something in August that she had set aside, a small irregularity in the household expenditure that did not match the receipts. A sum paid to a firm of solicitors she did not recognize, under a line she would have described as legal correspondence. She had been waiting to understand what it was before she named it to herself. Looking at it now, with the knowledge of Miss Cavendish in the center of the portrait, she thought she understood rather better. It was not anger. Anger would have been too simple and too wasteful. What moved through her was something colder and more precise, the particular clarity of a woman who has just confirmed that she has been made a fool of systematically, by someone who did not think her worth the trouble of a better forgery. She had kept these books. She had kept them faithfully and well, and someone had assumed that faithfulness made her blind. She was not blind. She was, it turned out, extraordinarily attentive. There was a tap at her door before she could decide what to do with her attentiveness. She closed the book and set her hands flat on the desk, which was the posture she kept when she needed her face to report nothing. "Come in." It was not her husband. It was James Holloway, who had been estate steward at Ashby Park for 12 years, and whose opinion of Marian could be read in the fact that he had never once addressed her as anything less than her full station. He was a compact man of 50, with the weathered look of someone who had spent years between a bad master and a worse conscience, and he held his hat with both hands in the manner of a man who has decided to say a difficult thing and wishes to have something to grip while he says it. Mrs. Ashby. He looked at the account book on the desk without looking at it, which was a considerable skill. I wonder if I might beg a moment. You have already had it. Sit down, Misty. Holloway, he sat. He turned his hat once around. The painter, ma'am. He arrived this morning with instructions I've not received from the master before regarding the arrangement of the sitting. I'm aware of the arrangement. Yes, ma'am. Another revolution of the hat. I've also been made aware this morning that certain legal documents have been drawn relating to a petition of marital dissolution, filed from this address, but not in a name I would have expected. He stopped. Then, with the deliberateness of a man laying a card he cannot retrieve, field in yours, ma'am. Marian's hands stayed flat. The copper quality of the afternoon light on her desk did not change. A bird continued its complaint in the chestnut outside. In mine, she said. A petition asserting abandonment, ma'am, and conduct prejudicial to the family interest. Signed, so I am told by a party I trust on this matter, in a hand that is not yours. The clarity she had felt before sharpened into something that had edges. She had not filed a petition. She had not signed anything. What she had done was maintain 7 years of accounts in a hand that anyone in this house could reproduce if they had access to her samples, which they did, because she had never thought to guard them. She looked at the account book. She thought of the solicitor's name she did not recognize. She thought of 17 months. Mr. Holloway, she said, and her voice was the same voice she used to authorize the ordering of firewood. How long have you known about this? He held her gaze. Since this morning, ma'am. I came directly. Then we have 11 days, she said, and a great deal of work to do before the portrait is hung. The steward exhaled, which was all the relief he permitted himself. Yes, ma'am, he said. I had rather hoped you would say something of that order. It was the year of the long summer, the kind that pressed on the Midlands like a hand and made tempers of glass, and Ashby Park had been crackling with it since June. Marian had come to the house as a practical bride, not a romantic one. Her father had been a solicitor of modest means, whose particular genius was for plant medicine, and she had inherited his eye for botanical evidence and his methodical patience, along with a working knowledge of account books that no finishing school had given her, and no one at Ashby Park had ever thought to value. She had made the house run. She had learned to be invisible, which in a house like this was simply survival. Gerald Ashby was not a cruel man in the manner of men who enjoyed cruelty. He was a man who found difficulty inconvenient and removed it by the most available means, and Marian had become a difficulty. She understood this without drama. She had perhaps been a difficulty since the end of the first year, when it became clear that her particular competences were administrative rather than ornamental, and that she was constitutionally unable to perform the agreeable blindness that would have made everyone comfortable. She saw things. She said what she saw, quietly, in the correct venue, which was the problem. The correct venue had been closed to her one at a time, without announcement, until she had understood she was speaking into an empty room. What she had not understood, until this morning, was that the empty room had been papered over with her own name. Lenora Cavendish had the gift of the house during the afternoons. She moved through the lower rooms with the ease of someone who has been told, privately, that they are already in possession of a thing. She was genuinely lovely if you liked a face that expressed itself at full volume, which the children did. Thomas, who was 6, had taken to following her like a duckling. Alice, at 4, was more conservative in her attachments and still watched Marian from doorways with a gravity that made Marian's chest ache in a way she filed under things not to think about until the accounts were settled. She was in the library the following morning when she met, for the first time properly, the painter. He was not what the word suggested. Edmund Daw was perhaps 35, with the build of a man who had spent his formation somewhere cold and physical, and he stood before the family portraits in the gallery with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who has been asked to do something he finds professionally embarrassing. He did not hear her come in, or if he heard her, he gave no sign of it. And she stood for a moment in the doorway watching him look at the former Mrs. Ashby in the oval frame, Gerald's mother, formidable woman, who had once told Marian that a house ran on the woman who kept its accounts, and God help the man who forgot it. The proportion of the center figure will dominate the composition regardless of the stated intention, Daw said, without turning, in case that is of any interest. Marian stepped into the gallery. You knew I was there. Your footfall is even. Most people hurry past portraits. He turned and assessed her with the evaluating look of his profession, the look that was not personal but merely calibrating. You are Mrs. Ashby. I am. I was told you had removed from the house. She held his gaze without difficulty. I am standing in it. Something shifted in his face, barely. He had a still quality. This painter, the kind that came from watching rather than from coldness, and it was different enough from Gerald's studied indifference that she noticed the distinction. I was given a sitting schedule, he said, that does not include you. I know what schedule you were given. She looked at the portrait of Gerald's mother. The old woman in the painting looked back with the painted satisfaction of the accurately rendered. Mr. Daw, are you a man who cares about what he commits to permanent record? A long pause. The morning light came in flat and early through the east windows. I am, he said, a man who has refused commissions before. Good, Marian said. Then I should like to speak with you about this one. She did not tell him everything that morning. She told him enough, that the sitting schedule had been arranged without her knowledge or consent, that she was the legal wife of record in this house and expected to be treated accordingly, and that if he had professional reservations about the composition he had been assigned, she would welcome them in writing at his convenience. He listened in the manner of someone accustomed to hearing the things said beneath the things said. When she finished, he looked at the empty wall where the new portrait would hang, and then back at her. The children, he said. They are yours. They are. Then I will need a sitting from you. Tomorrow, if the light holds. He picked up his case. I was told, when I took the commission, that the estate was recently widowed. I see now that was imprecise. He said it without inflection, naming the lie as a fact, which was more damning than anger would have been. Imprecise, Marian said. Yes, tomorrow then, Mrs. Ashby. He moved toward the door, then paused without turning. The woman in the fourth portrait from the left, she has your manner of standing. He left her alone with Gerald's ancestors, and the thin, sharp feeling of being correctly seen for the first time in longer than she could readily account for. She turned to the fourth portrait. It was a woman of perhaps 50, plain and composed, standing beside a desk with one hand resting on a stack of books, and she looked as though she had outlasted a great deal and intended to outlast more. Marian squared her own shoulders and went back to the accounts. Holloway had given her, that first morning, a name. Partridge, a clerk in the offices of the solicitor whose name she did not recognize, a firm called Hewson and Vale, with a brass plate on a street in the town that she had passed 100 times without occasion to enter. The clerk Partridge had a sister in the Ashby Park dairy, which was how information traveled in the country, like water along the lines of least resistance. And what had come through the dairy was this: the petition had been drafted 7 weeks ago, had been signed and witnessed in that office, and the signing had been attended by Miss Cavendish and a Mr. Vane, who was Gerald's cousin and managed the estate accounts since the position had been quietly removed from Marian's oversight 8 months prior. Oliver Vane. She had always known he disliked her, in the specific way of men who resent a woman's competence as a personal affront. He was meticulous, handsome in a finished way, and spoke to her in a register of elaborate courtesy that contained no warmth whatsoever. He attended Sunday dinners at the park, and always brought Gerald back from them in a worse humor than he had left. She had thought of him as a weather condition, unpleasant but not actionable. She had thought of him, in other words, with precisely the lack of attention he had counted on. It was Holloway who brought her the first solid piece. He set it on her desk on the 3rd morning, a single sheet, a copy of a household expenditure record from 6 months prior, in a hand that was very nearly hers. Very nearly. The 7s were wrong. Her 7s had a continental crossbar from her father's teaching. These did not. It was a small error, the kind you made when you were excellent at copying and had simply never seen the original's particularity. She had to look twice to see it herself. But she saw it. "The dairy girl will speak?" she asked Holloway. About what her brother told her, yes, not about the office. He folded his hands. "But there is the matter of what was used to produce the signature, ma'am. If the signature was produced in that office, there will have been a document carried there, a sample of your hand." "Yes," she said. She had been thinking about this. "The household accounts. A page or pages removed and returned. Or copied, photographed even. They have the equipment in the town now." She was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Holloway, the petition cites abandonment." "Yes, ma'am. I have not abandoned this house for a night in 7 years. I have the records of it. Every guest arrival, every tradesman's visit, every dinner party and household event, I am the record of this house." Holloway allowed himself a small and careful expression. "That had occurred to me as well, ma'am." 9 days remained. She used 3 of them doing what she had always done, running the house, keeping the books, being present in the rooms that required her presence. She let it be seen. She was not strategic about being seen. She was simply visible, consistently, as she had always been. And she let the house register it, because a house like this was its own archive, and she trusted it. The cook knew her movements. The footman knew her movements. The dairymaid knew her movements, and would remember them if asked in a venue that required it. On the 4th day, the sitting with Daw. The children were there, which made it both easier and harder. Thomas immediately assumed command of the room by standing on a footstool and declaring himself the center, which was such an accurate performance of the Ashby family tendency that Dowey pressed his mouth flat to suppress a reaction. Alice arranged herself against Marian's side in her characteristic way, spine very straight, chin up, not touching but present, and looked at the painter with the assessment of a small person, deciding whether trust was warranted. "She's deciding about you," Marian told him. "I know." Daw did not look away from Alice. "I had a sister who considered things the same way." He said it without sentimentality, the way people mention the weather of a specific remembered day. Then he looked at Marian, positioning, adjusting, asking her to turn by degrees, and the professional observation returned. The calibrating look. "You are reading the room," he said. "Even now, who is in it, where they stand, what they feel." "Habit," she said. "Your husband does not. It was not a question." No, she held the position he had asked for. Gerald notices what presents itself to him. It is not a criticism. It is simply what is, and it is why certain things were arranged in the direction of his attention. Dahl looked at his canvas for a moment. Then, the sitting schedule I was given. The arrangements. Who arranged them, do you think? She had not intended to tell him more. But she thought of the corrected copper pot, of the account books, of the petition filed in her name. She thought of 11 days becoming 7, a cousin, she said, and a companion, together, I believe, though the companion may be less principal than she appears. And the petition. She was quiet. I have ears, Mrs. Ashby. Houses like this are built to carry sound. He mixed a color with the same absorbed attention he gave everything. I was at Hewson and Vale last winter for a commission from one of their partners. A Mr. Oliver Vane was in the office when I arrived and did not see me. He paused. He was authorizing a document with some care. Marian's hands were very still. Did you see the document? I saw the letterhead. I saw the amount on the page. He looked at her directly, which he had not done yet in the sitting. I have been thinking about it since this morning. I think I know what it was, and I think, if I am asked in a formal setting, I will remember with some precision. She held his gaze. The children were growing restless on their footstools. Thomas had begun conducting a private argument with an imaginary party. She said quietly, "Why?" He returned to his work. "Because I was given a commission on false premises, because the composition I was asked to execute is a document, the same as any other, and I don't sign documents on false premises." A pause, the sound of a brush. "And because," he said, more quietly, "your daughter considers things carefully before she gives them her trust, and she has given you hers without reservation. That tells me something I find I cannot disregard." The light moved on the floor. Alice had found Marian's hand with her own small one and was holding it with the grave possessiveness of a 4-year-old who has made a decision. Marian looked down at her daughter's fingers and felt something move in her chest that was not the cold clarity of the last days, but something older and less armored, and she filed it under later, and breathed and held still for the painter's eye. 7 days. 5. The portrait was taking shape, and Gerald had not come to see it, which was either confidence or avoidance, and both possibilities suited Marian equally. She had not confronted her husband. She had considered it and set it aside. Confrontation required an audience to be useful. Gerald in a private room was a man who found difficulty inconvenient and removed it, and she had been removed from enough rooms. What she needed was the gathering, the 30 neighbors with their sherry, the freshly hung portrait at the head of the gallery. Witnesses, it was Holloway again who produced the second piece. He came to her on the 6th day with the look of a man carrying something fragile. He set a small package on her desk, wrapped in oilcloth, and she opened it to find a letter in Oliver Vane's hand, dated 14 months prior, addressed to Lenora Cavendish at her previous employer's address. She read it in the time it takes to understand a thing you have almost understood for a long while. It was not a love letter. It was a letter of business, meticulous and cold, describing in precise terms the arrangement being proposed, the installation of Miss Cavendish in the Ashby household, the petition to be filed in the wife's name at the appropriate interval, the division of what would follow. It mentioned, in passing, the household accounts as the vector of evidence. It mentioned Marian's father's hand and the Continental Sevens, and the need to practice past the particular. He had known about the sevens. He had tried and failed. "Where did you find this?" she asked Holloway. "I didn't." He was very carefully not looking at her. "Mrs. Petch did, in the lining of a traveling case in the blue guest room." He paused. The case belongs to Miss Cavendish. Marian set the letter down with great precision. She thought of Lenora Cavendish moving through the lower rooms with the ease of a woman already in possession. She thought of a girl who had perhaps been told a version of things that made her the instrument and not the architect, and who would be discarded the moment she had served her purpose, as Marian herself was being discarded. She felt the particular sorrow of it, which was not sympathy exactly, but something adjacent. "Keep it safe," she said. "I will want it in 3 days." Oliver Vane arrived on the 8th day, which was the day before the gathering, and she watched from the upper passage as he greeted Gerald in the hall below, with the warmth of a man who had done Gerald a service he was looking forward to having acknowledged. He was immaculate as always, dark-coated, gloved, with the studied ease of the person who believes the room is already his. She watched his hands, which were the hands of a man who had forged her signature, and she thought of the letter in oilcloth on her desk, and she went back to her accounts. That evening, she did the last thing she had needed to do. She knocked on the door of the sitting room where Lenora Cavendish spent her evenings and went in without waiting for the answer. The young woman looked up from her embroidery with an expression that moved rapidly through several preparations before settling on a gilded pleasantness. She was lovely in the lamplight. She was also, Marian saw now, frightened, which was information she had not had before. Marian sat down across from her and folded her hands and said nothing for a moment. "Mrs. Ashby," Miss Cavendish began. "I have read Mr. Vane's letter," Marian said, "the one from 14 months ago." The embroidery hoop went still. The young woman's face did something private and complicated and then went to careful blankness. "I don't know what letter you mean," she said. "Yes, you do." Marian kept her voice even. "I am not here to threaten you. I am here to tell you that what you know about the petition and the document can be given in a formal setting, or it can be withheld. If you give it, there will be consequences for Mr. Vane that will not fall on you, if your part was what his letter suggests it was. If you withhold it, the consequences fall differently." She let that settle. "I think you were told a story about this house and about me that served a purpose. I think the story was not accurate." Miss Cavendish's hands on the hoop were very white. The lamp between them steadied in the still air. Something in her face shifted, the precise shift of a person rereading a document they thought they had understood. "He said you had already left," she said. The words came out flat and surprised, as if she was hearing them freshly, that you had been gone since spring, that the petition was already filed, that it was only a matter of the arrangement being confirmed. "I have not left this house," Marian said. "Not for a day." A long silence. The clock on the mantel counted it. Lenora Cavendish looked at the embroidery in her hands, as though she had forgotten what it was for. "I was promised the center of the portrait," she said quietly, and the words had in them the sound of someone understanding, at last, what that had cost. Marian looked at her for a moment. Then she said, "If you speak when asked, I will make certain that your part in this is understood as it appears to have been. You have my word on it, and I keep my word." She left the young woman with the lamp and the hoop and the silence, and she walked back to her own room, and she sat at her mother's desk, and she looked at the account books in their row. And she thought of the gathering tomorrow and what it would require, and she allowed herself, privately and briefly, to be afraid. Then she straightened the books, corner to corner, and opened the topmost one, and went to work. The morning of the estate gathering was clear and cold, the sky a stripped autumn blue that put the whole park into high relief. Coaches had been arriving since mid-morning. The gallery had been opened, the portrait hung in its place, Doe's work, which had ended by containing no face in the center but the Ashby children's, and left a considered space that invited a question, and Gerald had looked at it with an expression Marian could not read from across the room, and had not come to ask for an explanation. She was in the gallery at 2:15 when Oliver Vane came to stand beside her. He stood close enough for the conversation to be private. He smelled of cedar and some tonic. He looked at the portrait with the small, concentrated expression of a man revising a plan mid-execution. "You look remarkably well for a woman in such an unsettled position," he said. She looked at the portrait. "The portrait is quite settled, I think. The portrait will be the least of it, once the papers are served." He said it with the gentleness he reserved for cruelty, the voice like a room with no edges. "It is unfortunate. I think Gerald would have preferred a simpler resolution." "But you made it complicated." "I kept the accounts," she said. "I expect that was complicating. Yes," he smiled. "Accounts can be kept in any hand." "They can," she agreed. "The difficulty is the practice. One tends to reveal the particular." She turned to look at him directly for the first time. "My sevens have a crossbar. My father taught me. It is quite consistent across 7 years of record." A pause. "Mr. Da mentioned something interesting this morning, by the way, about Hewson and Vale." The smile did not vanish, but it made an adjustment. A small one. The kind a composed man makes when a variable he had not planned for announces itself. "He was there last winter," she said, "for a commission. He has a very reliable eye, being a painter. He remembers the documents he saw on the desk. He remembers the amounts. He remembers, he tells me, your handwriting." "A painter's recollection is not evidence," Vane said, still soft. "No, but a letter is." She watched his face, the line of his jaw, the precise stillness that preceded something being recalculated. "Your own hand, Mr. Vane, in your own letter, 14 months old, naming every arrangement and every mechanism, including the particular challenge of the sevens." The gallery filled softly with arriving guests, the warm noise of county society preparing to admire itself. Gerald was somewhere to the left with 2 magistrates he considered friends. Holloway was near the door. Di was at the far end with his hands behind his back, looking at the floor. "You don't have it," Vane said. "Don't I?" A pause. He looked at the portrait again, and she saw him decide. When he looked at her, his face had composed itself into a very particular expression, the expression of a man choosing to disbelieve what is in front of him, because believing it requires something he is not prepared to do. "Whatever you think you have, Marian, whatever you think this accomplishes, Mrs. Ashby," she said. "Please." And she raised her voice by exactly the fraction required to address, without apparent effort, the 2 magistrates who had drawn closer. "Mr. Crane, Mr. Benton, I wonder if you might spare me a moment." What happened next was a matter of perhaps 20 minutes, and it was conducted in the drawing room adjacent, with the door open and the gathering's ambient noise just audible as a reminder of witnesses. Holloway produced the oilcloth package. Duchess was called in and gave his account of Hewson and Vale with the precision of a man describing a painting he has memorized, which he had. Marian laid the forged account page beside 6 years of originals and pointed to the sevens, one after another, cross-barred without exception, and then pointed to the forgery's clean strokes and said nothing, because nothing was required. Oliver Vane stood through it with the stillness of a man at his own reckoning. He said twice that this was an orchestrated defamation. He looked at Gerald, who had been brought in at Holloway's quiet request, and now stood near the window with the expression of a man watching a house he thought was sound discover its own foundations. He looked at Lenora Cavendish, who had come in at some point and stood near the door, and said, when Mr. Crane asked her directly whether the petition had been filed in her presence, yes, and I was told the wife had already gone. I would like to say so plainly before these witnesses. One question. One answer. The kind of crack that does not close. Oliver Vane looked at his cousin. Gerald looked at the floor. And then Vane looked at Marian, and what moved across his face in that moment was not rage and not cunning, but something older and less managed. The face of a man who had spent 30 years in second place and built his entire architecture on the assumption that second place could be rectified, and who understood now that it could not, that the architecture was the problem, and that the problem was himself, and it lasted only a second before his composure returned, but she saw it. She had been reading faces for 7 years in this house. She felt, unexpectedly, sorry for him. Mr. Crane spoke to Gerald in a low voice for several minutes. Gerald listened with his chin down, and the particular look he had when convenience and conscience were conducting their usual negotiation. Marian waited. She was very good at waiting. In the end, it was Gerald who spoke to his cousin. He did it quietly, and with the decency she had always known he was capable of, and had been grieved to see him neglect. He said, Oliver would remove himself from the estate management, from the house, from the county, if it could be managed. There would be an allowance, a modest one, since she was watching, and he knew she was watching, and knew she was already calculating what modest meant. There would be no prosecution, no public naming, no letter to the professional societies. There would be silence in both directions, and Oliver would take it and be grateful, because the alternative was a solicitor's letter of a different kind than he had arranged for. Oliver Vane took it. He took it without grace at first, and then, at the door, with the quiet acceptance of a man who has run out of moves and knows it, and Marian saw him hesitate and then look back at her, and she said, "Because it was true, and because truth was all she had ever had in this house, I hope you find a place you can manage without this kind of arithmetic, Mr. Vane." She meant it. He saw that she meant it. He left. Miss Cavendish was another matter, and Marian went to her herself that evening, after the guests had gone and the house had settled back into its particular quiet. The young woman was in the sitting room again, the lamp in the same place, but the embroidery had been set aside, and she sat with her hands in her lap like someone who has recently put down a heavy object. Marian sat across from her again. "You will want to know what becomes of you," she said. "I would not blame you," Miss Cavendish said, "for any outcome you chose." "I know you wouldn't." Marian looked at her. "You have a sister in Bath, I believe, a teacher." The young woman looked up. "I have been in correspondence with the Whitmore School there for some time about a position in household management. I think you are perhaps better suited to it than to what you were asked to do here." A pause. "It is not a grand life. But it is yours, which this was not." Miss Cavendish looked at her hands for a long moment. Then she looked up, and her eyes were bright with something she was clearly determined not to allow to proceed further, and she said, with the careful dignity of someone relearning it, "You are very generous." "I am practical," Marian said. Generosity is a word people use when they are surprised that a cost was not extracted. She stood. "Sleep well, Miss Cavendish. The position will be there when you are ready for it." She found Gerald in the study, as she had known she would. He stood by the fire with a glass he had not drunk, and the look of a man who had been thinking for several hours about how to begin a conversation that his nature was ill-equipped to begin. "Marian," he said. "Gerald," she sat in the chair by the window, not the suppliant's chair near the door, but the one she had always used when they discussed the household, the chair that faced him as an equal. "You needn't explain yourself. I understand what happened well enough. I'm not sure you do." He set the glass down. He looked tired in a way she had not seen before. the tiredness of a man who has had the architecture of a comfortable self-deception removed in an afternoon. He said you wished to go. He showed me letters. I thought. I allowed myself to think they were yours. You allowed yourself, she said, not cruelly, precisely. He absorbed that. Yes, the children, she said. Whatever else is discussed, the children are not a negotiation. No, he said it without hesitation, which was the first thing he had done without hesitation in some time, and she marked it. No, they are not. He was quiet for a moment. Marian, I am sensible of what has been done in this house and what I permitted by not looking. She thought of 7 years of accounts. She thought of the forged sevens, the careful practice, the one thing that had been wrong. She thought of Alice's hand in hers at the sitting and the portrait on the wall with its considered space. She thought of costs. I will tell you, she said, what I require going forward. And you will listen, because I have carried this house for 7 years in silence, and I do not intend to do so again. And then we will see. He listened. She told him. It was not a warm conversation, but it was an honest one, which was the only kind she had ever been able to have. And when she finished, he was quiet for a while, and the fire settled, and outside an owl started up in the park. The portrait, he said. Da left it as it is, the space in the center. Yes, I should like to commission the space filled. Gerald said. He looked at his glass, if you would sit for it. She considered this for a long moment. Then she said, I'll consider it, which was neither yes nor no, but was true, and she left him in the study and walked up the stairs to the corridor where the children slept. She stood for a moment at Alice's door. Inside, her daughter breathed the slow, deep breath of a child who has been carried to bed and has not woken. It was the most peaceful sound in the house, and Marian stood in the door and listened to it, and let herself feel what had been banked for 11 days. Not triumph, nothing so simple as that, but something more like the quietness after a long account has been correctly rendered, every column entered, every sum proved. The book closed with the knowledge that it would bear examination. She went to bed. She slept. The following spring arrived without particular announcement, as springs do. First the snowdrops along the kitchen passage, then a morning when the air came through the east window with warmth behind it instead of simply the absence of cold, and Marian sitting at her mother's desk with the first quarter's accounts open before her. Heard a sound in the corridor and looked up to find Da standing in the doorway. He had come to hang the completed portrait. The center was filled now, not grandly, not as a statement, just correctly, which was its own kind of statement. She had sat for it in February on 3 mornings when the light was good, and Alice had insisted on being present for all 3, and had spent the time conducting a comprehensive assessment of the painter's supply case, which Da had permitted with the patience of a man who had decided some people were worth the trouble. It's done, he said from the doorway. So I hear. She set down her pen. She had heard, in fact, from Holloway, who had heard from the cook, who had heard from the carpenter who helped with the hanging, that it was very good. She had learned to trust the chain. Thank you, Miss Doway. He came into the room a little further, which he did not usually do uninvited, and he held his hat with both hands in precisely the way Holloway had on that first morning, which she noticed. And he said, I wanted to ask you something, not as your painter. She waited. Outside, a blackbird was doing what blackbirds do in April, declaring its claim on everything in earshot with a thoroughness that admitted no argument. I have a brother in Norwich, Dai said. He keeps his own accounts and has for years, and they are not as orderly as they might be. He stopped. His thumb moved once across the brim of his hat. What I am asking, Mrs. Ashby, is not about the accounts." She looked at him for a moment. She thought of the sitting, and Alice's hand, and the grave attention of a man who had refused to sign a document on false premises. She thought of what he had said about the fourth portrait and the manner of standing. "Sit down, Mr. Daw," she said. He sat. She closed the account book. Outside the window, the blackbird had found a particular high note and was repeating it with satisfaction, and the light in the room was the new pale gold of early spring, and it lay across the desk and the closed book, and the space between them with the quality of something being offered rather than imposed. And she thought that this particular morning, with the accounts settled and the window open and the sound of the house running as it should around her, was perhaps a thing she would remember afterward for a long time. "I will hear," she said, "what you mean to ask, and I will tell you, Mr. Daw, that whatever I answer, it will be because I choose it, and for no other reason. That is the only ground I stand on." He looked at her with the direct assessing look that she had come to understand was his version of respect, seeing clearly and reporting truthfully what he saw. "That," he said, "is exactly the ground I had in mind." The blackbird outside went on with its April business. The morning held them both in its early light, and Marian Ashby sat at her mother's desk and listened. And the window was open, and the new season pressed in without asking permission, as new seasons do. They were married in October, the year turning toward its close, in the small church on the Ashby Lane, with a congregation that numbered 14 if you were generous and 12 if you were precise. Thomas wore his best coat and was intolerably pleased with himself throughout the ceremony, which made Holloway bite his lips together with great effort and failed entirely with the cook, who wept without apology into a handkerchief the size of a small flag. Alice held Marian's flowers with the seriousness of someone entrusted with a diplomatic object of state and did not drop them, and looked at the painter with the expression of a child who has been considering a matter for some time and arrived at her conclusion. Gerald Ashby was not present, which was proper, but he had sent a letter that Marian had read once and put away, in which he had said things that were honest and insufficient and true, and she had answered it in her own hand, with her continental sevens, and whatever was between them after that was the kind of peace that is arrived at by account rather than by feeling, which is the only kind that keeps. Oliver Vane had removed to the north, where he had, by reliable report, a position managing a smaller estate, and was conducting himself without incident, which was the best that could be said, and was, she thought, enough. Lenora Cavendish was in Bath before the summer's end, and the letter she sent at the New Year was brief and oddly tentative, as though she was not sure of her welcome. And Marian wrote back at once, which seemed to settle something for the girl. "The Whitmore position suits me," Miss Cavendish had written. "I find I prefer the work of a house to being an ornament in one." She had added, in a postscript, "I think you knew that about me before I did. Perhaps you knew a great deal of things before I did." Marian had read the postscript twice and then smiled, and put the letter in the drawer with Gerald's and let them keep each other company in the dark. The portrait hung in the Daw household from the beginning of their life together, in the light of the passage where you came in from the garden. Alice at 4, straight-spined and considering. Thomas, 6, conducting his invisible argument with such commitment that Daway had included it, to Marian's initial objection and subsequent agreement, because a portrait that tells the truth is a portrait worth keeping. Marian herself, at the desk edge, one hand on the account book, looking at something just to the left of the viewer, not at the room, not at the painter, but at the place where the thing that required attention would arrive, as it always did, as she had always been there to meet it. It was April again when she came through the garden door and found Daw in the passage looking up at it, as he sometimes did in the mornings. Thomas had discovered the pond and was conducting a comprehensive investigation into its properties. Alice was in the kitchen, arguing with Cook about the appropriate jurisdiction of each party over the biscuits, an argument Cook would lose in the end, as she always did, with every sign of enjoyment. She stood beside him and looked up at herself. The light from the garden window fell across the canvas the way it always did at this hour, finding the gold in the account book's spine, the careful order of the desk, the woman looking at the door about to open. "She looks," he said, "as though she knows exactly what is coming." "She does," Marian said. "She always did." He offered her his arm and she took it, and the morning light moved on the floor as it always moves, and outside the blackbird had taken up its position in the apple tree, and everything was as it was, which was, all things considered, precisely what she had worked for. If this story warmed you, the careful woman who kept her accounts and her word when everything else was taken from her, then you know what I mean when I say this fire is always lit, and the chair beside it is yours whenever you want it. Stay, if you like. There are more stories here, as long as the evenings hold. I'd love to know, what was the moment you knew for her? The sevens, the sitting, the letter in the oilcloth? Tell me in the comments. I read every word. And if you want to keep your place by this fire, there's a small thing you can do before you go to make sure the next story finds you. Sleep well and be faithful to the things that bear examination.